Hi and welcome back to the Girl Gone London channel. Today we are digging into the differences between news in the US and the UK. I think this is a more important topic than ever, understanding how people consume news and how the news is presented in each country, because there are some major differences. Let's start with how adults in each country consume the news. According to recent research, news websites and television are the top two means of getting the news in both countries, but TV news wins out in the UK still, but it's flipped in the US, where digital devices come above television. Print and radio has also died out in the US at a higher percentage than the UK. 5% of Americans say they get their news through print and 6 to 7% through radio, while 22% of Brits say they still get news through radio, and a combined 20% say they get their news from some type of printed newspaper. And when I do say print, I am talking about the specifically printed piece of newspaper. The online versions of these newspapers are included in other parts of these statistics. Now, before we draw any big conclusions from these numbers, we need to look at each area individually to see what is actually available news-wise in each of these countries. I think TV news is the most interesting, so we'll save that until the end, and I'll explain why one of my friends once told me that they thought American TV news was all footage of squirrels riding skateboards. But let's start with bias, actually, because regardless of the source, whether you watch it on TV or are engaging with the news online, the vast majority of news in both countries, actually in all countries, is inherently biased. Straight reporting of literally nothing but the facts is almost impossible. Even if I were to tell you that I saw a dog with a blue collar walk past my window, which does seem like an unbiased statement, the words I use and what facts I include, what facts I leave out, and the order in which I tell you the facts are all at least slightly impacted by me, my experiences, and how I want to convey the information to you. Even if there's nothing controversial about a dog with a blue collar passing by my window, which by the way did not happen, but I do love dogs, so hopefully we're manifesting this happening. Anyway, the point is, bias is inherent within news, but obviously then you have left-wing or right-wing bias in both countries based on a news outlet's political leanings. In the US, this is a great chart. There's a lot on it here, so we'll point out some major US news outlets. Closer to the middle, we have ABC, NBC, and Forbes, though they are still put on the left of the middle. Then further left, you have CNN and MSNBC. To the right of the middle, you have the Wall Street Journal, and funnily enough, the Daily Mail, which is considered much further right-wing in the UK than it is in the USA, which just goes to show you the skew of the political spectrum in the US. Anyway, further to the right, we have Fox News, Newsmax, and then if we keep going, we've got things like Faithwire and One America Network. In the UK, take a look at this chart, which shows us the skew of popular UK news outlets. These are in print, with the red representing left-wing and the blue representing right-wing. So you have The Guardian and The Mirror as major left-wing papers, with The Independent a little bit more central, then The Times, The Telegraph, The Sun, The Daily Express, and The Daily Mail as right-wing. Then we can take a look at this chart, which has to do with who trusts which UK news brand based on their political leaning. It's a little confusing if you don't have time to study the chart, so I'll just point out some of the interesting observations. The most concentrated trust is in the BBC from all political leanings, and while there is constant debate over whether the BBC is right-wing or left-wing or really as centrist as they're supposed to be, they're definitely the most respected news source in the UK according to research, and the most widely consumed by both the left and the right sides of the political spectrum. Channel 4 News also gets a bit of love in this chart from those who consider themselves center in political leanings, and then you've got papers like The Sun that bring both sides of the aisle together and how much they do not trust it. GB News is considered conservative media in the UK, with over 50% of right-wing people saying they trust it, according to this poll, but The Telegraph is also conservative media, but in a different way. They are more well-respected by those in the center and those on the left than GB News. So just because something does have a bias one way or the other, it does not make it equal or similar in trustworthiness. Overall, if you break it all down and do the research, UK media traditionally skews right and US media traditionally skews at least slightly left based on political leaning within that country. We can't compare them outright because the political spectrum is different, but you can get an idea. And again, this is not a commentary of what is right or what is correct or what is wrong, using right wing or left wing with any sort of emotion behind it. Whether you love The Guardian or GB News or Fox News or MSNBC, you have to acknowledge that there is bias within the news you consume. If you consume conservative media because you're conservative, great. If you prefer The Guardian because you're left leaning, also great. But at least own it. Be curious and consume other forms of news to see how other papers and channels are covering the same topics. Anyway, soapbox aside, we'll talk radio briefly and then get into television news and local news because this is where the major differences in the countries start appearing. In the UK, as I talked about earlier in the video, radio is still a decently popular source of news. Much of it comes from the BBC, to be honest, whether you're listening to BBC Radio 4 for mostly the news, or you're listening to shorter news segments on BBC Radio 1 or 2. In the US, we don't really have an equivalent. This is an entirely different video about radio in the UK versus the USA, so we won't go too deep here, but America is made up of more local stations that are primarily music. You can find local news radio stations like Central Florida, where I'm from, has 90.7 FM Central Florida Public Media, and they run some NPR, which stands for National Public Radio programs, but very few people are actually listening to that to get their news compared to how many people might turn on like BBC4 in a day. The Central Florida News radio station isn't even something I had heard of. I just had to look it up to make sure I had the facts when talking about news radio stations in Central Florida, and I lived there for a solid 20 years. Now, in the US, we do have popular talk radio stations. However, I would argue that instead of being news, a lot of these would classify as entertainment. Not all of them. Some of them do have more newsy segments than others, but from my experience, again, talk radio kind of masquerades sometimes as news, but it's often more like a podcast style listening experience where it's more about the discussion between participants and the entertainment version of it. Now we're going to turn to television news, but before I do that, I want to make a point about print news that differs between countries that's going to be a common theme when we get to talking about television. Now, the other day, I was visiting a friend in a town outside of London. Doesn't matter which one, just pick a random one. I went into an Asda and looked at the print news section to see what I could find. As I suspected, you essentially had choices of all the major national papers, most of the ones I had listed earlier, like The Guardian, The Telegraph, The Times. And if there's one thing these all share, like I said, it's that these are national papers. I couldn't find a local paper, and when I say local paper, I mean local to the town or at least the nearest city to where I was. My experience in the UK isn't unusual, as research shows that 273 out of 407 local authority districts do not have a local paper, and the ones that do are constantly closing down. And the difference here to the US is that in the US, we do have national papers like the Wall Street Journal and USA Today. But actually, most people, if they still buy a paper in the US, are going to buy their local paper. In Orlando, it's the Orlando Sentinel. This is where most people during the age of print news in the US got their news from. Not a national outlet, but their local one, like the Augusta Chronicle, the Fayetteville Observer, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, the Santa Fe New Mexican. There are plenty more like this. And so while UK print media tends to cover national news as its main focus and then branch out into international news, US print media tends to cover local news as its main focus and then branch out into national news and then into international news, leaving less space for the international news as we've now used up a huge part of the paper and huge focus on the local news and happenings. The same thing happens in television. Television news in the UK tends to be much more national rather than local. There are local segments of TV news programming. So for the BBC, England is split into over 10 regions and then one for Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And the entire UK-wide national coverage does cut to the local coverage for 5 to 10 minute segments throughout the day, and then you get 30 minutes of regional news in the early evening. which makes sense for the UK. It's much more compact than the US and with fewer people, so there isn't necessarily enough local news to warrant a dedicated all-day local news program. But in the US, viewers tend to do the same as we do with newspapers and consume their hyper-local news. So for instance, Dayton and Cincinnati are two cities in Ohio that are 1 hour apart, which is absolutely nothing for how large America is. So honestly, they are very close together. But Dayton has its own full local news channel, WDTN. This is TV news, as you can see in this clip. But we can also check out their website and see how the news is spread out, with top stories about local attacks, local traffic accidents, and then at the bottom, after it's country fair season, you have bits about the Olympics in France. Dig further once you click on the news, and again, we can see that it's news about Ohio, then a piece about the Ohio State Fair's butter cow sculptures, then news about the county Dayton is in, and then a piece about Olympic fan scamming, then 3 more pieces that are based in local news. This is how Americans mostly consume news, and I think most people don't realize this who are in the UK and are used to consuming mostly national news rather than local. You can see from the butter cow sculpture example why my friend made a remark that American news is just watching squirrels on skateboards. The point was that it's about some funny interest piece, some human interest thing that has to do with a local happening, but actually the vast majority of the headlines are about things that will actually impact the local residents and are a bit more serious than butter sculptures. News anchors and correspondents in all countries can develop followings, but in the US, we tend to follow and listen to our local news people. There are meteorologists in Florida who are major local celebrities. I can still name them after not living there for 10 years. Tom Sorrells and Tom Terry, shout out to you. Then you've got East Idaho News in the state of Idaho that have actually gone viral every Christmas across YouTube for their Secret Santa pieces. And honestly, if you want to cry for like 6 hours about the goodness of humanity, definitely check it out. But we can also see from their website that as you scroll down, the national and world news is there, but it's just at the very bottom. Now, this doesn't mean that plenty of people in the US aren't also watching national TV news like CNN and ABC and our national news programming. They are, but much of American news is built on this local aspect, and you might think it's silly talking about where to get the best pie and butter cow sculptures and Secret Santa, but while it does mean that on the whole, I would wager Americans are less educated when it comes to international news, it does build a sense of community within American towns and cities that America is quite famous for. America is a very geographically isolated country despite being large, and with a vast population, there is enough local news to go around that it does tend to dominate before moving on to the other headlines, and that's a major difference from the UK, which tends to go national first, then international, then possibly local as a side note. Whether this is right or wrong or better or worse is not what this video is about, but feel free to comment below and let me know what you think. Hopefully I've given you some more context to understand each country and where they're getting their news from a little bit better. As always, thanks very much for watching. Don't forget to check your sources, and I'll see you next time.